There are days when loneliness doesn't show itself through a sigh, but through a silence so long, so haunting, that it echoes inside your very own home. I live in a small, quiet neighborhood, the kind where people wave while mowing their lawns, ask how you're doing when picking up the mail, and then keep walking. Not noisy, not intimate, just enough to be part of the scenery. I, Martha, have lived here for most of my life, but lately I no longer feel like I'm part of anything. With age comes aching knees, unexplained fatigue, and worst of all, the sense that I'm slowly fading away from this world. I sat in my familiar armchair, staring out at the garden I once cared for. Now the grass is patchy. The flowers no longer bloom like they used to. I don't have the strength. And worse still, I no longer look forward to anything. Family is busy. Friends have grown distant. I blame no one. But my heart has never felt more barren. And that's when the knock came. It startled me. No one had called ahead. No one ever dropped by unannounced. My heart skipped, not from fear, but because, strangely, such an ordinary sound reminded me that I still existed. I walked over, opened the door, and there he was, standing in the soft afternoon light, Ben. Ben, the neighbor who's lived next door for a few years now. A quiet man, reserved. Around my age, we'd exchanged nods, talked about the weather, but we had never truly looked each other in the eye. Today, he held a small bag and wore a gentle smile. "Hello, Miss Martha." The first time he'd ever said my name. "I made some chicken soup. Thought you might need something warm." I stood still, not sure if it was surprise or the stirring of something I hadn't felt in so long. Being noticed. "Thank you, Ben." I reached for the bag, my hands trembling just a little. "You look a bit tired. If you ever need someone to talk to, or just sit with, don't hesitate to knock. We're neighbors after all." He turned and walked away, slowly, without expecting anything. But those words, they clung to something parched and quiet inside me. I stepped back into the house, cradling the bag of soup as if holding a kind of warmth I couldn't name. And I cried, not out of sadness, but because, for the first time in a very long while, I felt like I was still someone worth knocking on the door for. If you've ever felt like you're slowly disappearing from everyone's eyes, if you've ever lived in a house full of lights but no visitors, then subscribe to this channel, because here, every story is a gentle knock on your door, reminding you that you're still here, that someone, truly, might still see you. And then, just one day later, when Ben returned with a small bag of fresh fruit, I realized it wasn't the food that warmed my heart. It was the look in someone's eyes, who truly wanted to ask, "Are you okay?" That evening, I opened the bag of soup Ben had left. The aroma of simmered chicken and vegetables filled the kitchen. Not extraordinary, but strangely comforting. I couldn't remember the last time I had a hot meal, and even less the last time someone had cooked one for me. I ladled the soup into a bowl and sat at the table. Not because I was hungry, but out of respect for the kindness that had just been offered. And as the first spoonful touched my lips, I suddenly felt a sting behind my nose. Not from the seasoning, but from a heart. That night, I didn't sleep, not because I was in pain or tired, but because my mind kept circling one thought. Ben noticed. Someone I never expected to care was the first to knock. When I was beginning to fade into invisibility within my own life, he didn't say much. Just, "If you need someone to talk to, just knock." Simple, but true. The next morning, I sat by the window. Sunlight slanted gently through the wilted flower box. Something inside me felt different, lighter, more open, and I realized maybe I hadn't entirely disappeared. Someone had seen me, truly seen me. That afternoon, the knock came again. Soft, but sure. I opened the door, and once again, it was Ben. This time, he held a basket of fruit, apples, pears, a few peaches. He gave a small smile, his eyes meeting mine with a strange familiarity. "Just a few fresh things," he said. I noticed you don't go out much. Thought maybe you'd like them. I took the basket, my hands slightly trembling, not from weakness, but because my heart was slowly relearning how to feel. Ben, you don't have to do this. I know, he replied, but I want to. We didn't say much, but when he turned to leave, I stood there for a long while, on the doorstep, holding a basket of fruit, watching the quiet figure walk away, and feeling an unfamiliar warmth. I'm not used to being cared for, even less so being noticed. But in that moment, a small crack opened inside me, and from that crack, something began to grow. That night, I placed my hand over my chest and felt my heart beating, not from illness, but because, for the first time in many years, I felt alive.
And seen. Truly.
Since that day, Ben didn't knock on my door every day.
But I always knew when he passed by.
Whether it was a simple wave when I happened to stand by the window, or a small nod as he took the trash out, each of those moments quietly planted something I thought I had lost, the belief that I was still seen. There were mornings when I sat silently at the table, hands wrapped around a cup of tea I hadn't yet touched, eyes drifting toward the front yard, when the sunlight sliced through the trees and fell across the windowsill. I'd often see Ben bend over, tending to the flowers by the fence. He didn't know I was watching, or maybe he did, but he never changed his pace. No words, no efforts to draw attention, just a man, living next door, present. I began looking forward to those mornings, not because I expected anything special to happen, but because sometimes to see someone and know they also know you're there is enough to give you a reason to keep going. Ben didn't ask much. Instead, he left small things behind. A bag of oranges hanging from the doorknob, a note that read, "Today's fruit is extra sweet. Make sure to eat." His handwriting was plain, but warm, like early spring sunlight. Some days it was a few sprigs of basil. Other times, a bag of homemade butter cookies. Simple gifts, never random. As if he knew, I didn't need anything grand. I just needed a reason to feel like today was different from yesterday. What gnawed at me, though, was how unfamiliar I was with being cared for. All these years, I had trained myself to be strong, to cook alone, go to the pharmacy alone, drive myself to appointments and come home in silence. I used to believe I didn't need anyone, but the truth is, I was just too afraid to need again, because I had needed before, and was let down. I had fallen, and no one caught me. Ben didn't do anything extravagant, but he showed up, quietly,
Steadily.
without asking for anything in return. And it was in those small things. A spoonful of soup, an apple, a few words left on a piece of paper, that the locked door inside me slowly began to open. One afternoon, I gathered the courage to wait for Ben outside. As he passed by, I said, "Thank you for everything." He looked at me, his gaze gentle and unhurried. "Martha, I didn't do anything big. Sometimes someone just needs to know they're still here." I laughed, not loudly, but enough to surprise myself. Maybe because it had been so long since I'd laughed without forcing it. That night, I sat by the window, the streetlight casting a warm golden hue over my teacup. For the first time, I brewed 2 cups of tea, even though I knew only one would be drunk. But maybe, just setting out a second chair was already a quiet declaration. I was no longer afraid of emptiness. I was learning to welcome presence again. I wrote in my journal, "They say it takes grand gestures to change a life. But I think sometimes a patient glance, an orange on your doorstep, or a person who doesn't leave when you fall silent is enough to make you believe you still matter." I had been silent for so long that I had forgotten how warm my own voice used to be.
But then,
one quiet afternoon, in a small kitchen with just 2 people and a pot of boiling tea, I finally said aloud something I had kept inside for years. That evening, when I brewed tea for myself, I poured a second cup, even with no one there. Maybe tomorrow would still be lonely. But today, my heart knew. I was no longer just a fading shadow in the neighborhood. That day, the wind blew. Not strong, but enough to scatter a few dry leaves across the yard. I sat by the window, hands wrapped around a cup of hot tea. A restlessness stirring inside me. Not for any specific reason, just a sense, a feeling. And I was right. A knock at the door. Not hurried, not hesitant, just enough to say, "I'm here." It was Ben, carrying a small basket of fruit and a few sprigs of fresh mint. "Minty goes well with autumn afternoons," he said, eyes holding that familiar, quiet gentleness. I smiled.
Commune.
I just put the kettle on. Perfect timing. We sat in the kitchen. A space that had been too quiet for too long now held the soft clinking of cups, the sound of a spoon stirring through steam. Ben sat across from me, calm, unhurried. We spoke of the weather, the trees by the fence shedding their leaves, the stray cat that visited the backyard every evening. But between the pauses in conversation, something lingered, as if we were both waiting for the other to say something first. And then I did, my voice low, so as not to break the fragile peace that had settled. I used to be terrified of people seeing me as weak. Ben didn't speak. He just looked at me without blinking, without interrupting. His gaze wasn't probing, but a quiet space safe enough for me to go on. I was sick for a long time. People still cared, but over time, they grew tired. I saw it in their eyes. The sympathy, the avoidance. So I learned to go silent, to pretend I was okay, so no one would have to carry me. My voice cracked at the end. Ben placed his hand on the table, close to mine, but not touching, just there, like a small life raft floating between calm waves. "That sounds familiar," he said, smiling gently. "I've been there too, for the first time in years." I spoke of the days spent alone in hospital rooms, the cold light above, the machines ticking in rhythm. I spoke of feeling like a burden, like an inconvenience in others' lives, of eating dinner alone, and turning on the TV just to avoid hearing the sound of my own heartbeat. Ben didn't interrupt. He didn't try to make it better. He just sat there, real and close. Then he shared about his late wife, about the illness that lasted 7 long years, about caring for her, not out of duty, but because he was afraid that if he stopped, she would disappear for real. We were no longer just two neighbors sharing tea. We were two old wounds, quietly watching each other begin to heal. Before leaving, Ben stood and looked at me, this time for a long while. "Martha, I'm really glad you spoke today. Not because I needed to know, but because maybe now, you won't have to carry it all alone anymore." I watched him walk to the door.
Inside,
something that had been tightly wound for years began to loosen. That night, I lit a small candle in the kitchen, not because the power was out, but because I wanted the light to shine on the things I used to hide. And maybe tomorrow, I'll invite Ben to dinner, not out of politeness, but because I truly want to share a meal with the first person
who made me feel safe enough to speak.
I stood in the kitchen, fumbling with a tablecloth I hadn't used in years. The scent of pork stew with vegetables rose from the gently simmering pot, filling the room in soft waves. It wasn't a fancy dish, but I had cooked it with a kind of anticipation I wasn't yet familiar with. Tonight, Ben would be having dinner at my house. When he knocked, I was ready. The candles were lit, their soft glow resting on the old wooden table, recalling evenings long past, when there were voices, the clinking of spoons, and laughter mingled with sighs. I greeted Ben with a smile, so natural. Even I was surprised by it. "This feels cozy," he said, eyes pausing on the candlelight. I thought maybe a gentler light might help soften the heart too. I replied, placing an extra napkin by his plate. We ate in a silence that felt easy. No need for many words, just the occasional compliment from Ben, or the moment I ladled more soup into his bowl. And with that, something quietly shifted. A kind of familiarity began to return, not tied to the past, but to the present we were now living. Ben shared with me his solitary evenings, the habit of turning on only the kitchen light, making tea, and sitting in the stillness of a house without voices. I listened in silence and realized that we had both spent a long time living inside the same quiet, just from two different houses. There was a time I thought I had learned how to live alone, I said, as I set down my plate. But now I know I'd only learned how to endure it. Ben didn't say anything, but he gently touched the back of my hand, as if to say, "You don't have to endure it anymore." After dinner, we sat by the window, looking out at the backyard. The moon was halfway up. A breeze floated through. I told him about the lavender pot that once bloomed violet all summer, now reduced to bare stems. He listened, then said softly, "The garden will bloom again, when someone tends to it." I looked at him. The words were gentle, but I knew he wasn't just talking about flowers. When I walked Ben to the door, I paused on the threshold and felt full, not because anything dramatic had happened, but because everything had unfolded so naturally that I realized I was truly living again, not just holding on. The next day, I went to the farmer's market for the first time in months. As I picked out ripe peaches, I suddenly remembered Ben liked peaches. He once told me, "You should pick the ones still warm from the sun, they're sweeter." And for the first time in a long while, I wanted to bring something home, not just for myself. A week after that dinner, Ben invited me over to his house. It wasn't for any special occasion, just a quiet Sunday afternoon, tea and cookies, and soft jazz humming from an old record player. His house was simple, neat, but in one corner of the room, there was a photo frame tilted slightly, as if it didn't want to be fully seen, yet hadn't been put away either. I walked toward it. Ben's eyes followed me, but he didn't stop me. A black and white photo, a woman smiling, gently, and eyes that seemed to have once known all the joys and sorrows of the man standing beside her.
"Lisa,"
Ben said, his voice barely above a whisper sent to the wind. "My wife." I turned to look at him. He didn't look away, but in his eyes was a kind of quiet that ran deep and far. "She was beautiful," I said, honestly.
"Yes, and strong."
"She lived with cancer, as if it were just an uninvited guest, but not strong enough to stop her from smiling." Ben shared, for the first time, about those 7 years of being a husband, a friend, a nurse, a driver taking her to chemo appointments, of sleepless nights, not because he feared losing her, but because he couldn't bear watching her in pain. He spoke in an even tone, like someone who had rehearsed it 1,000 times in his mind. But I knew this was the first time he had ever let those words leave his mouth. I sat beside him in silence, because the deepest wounds don't need fixing. They just need to be heard. Finally, he sighed softly, then reached for the photo frame. He folded down the stand at the back and laid the picture flat. "I think
Lisa wouldn't be sad
if I started truly living again." We sat there together, saying nothing more, but I placed my hand gently on his.
Soft, slow.
And for the first time, I no longer felt like I was facing a man who had once been broken, but someone who was bravely walking through it. And so was I. The leaves had started to change color, and on a crisp morning, Ben asked if I'd like to go on a weekend getaway. "Not far," he said. "Just a small wooden cabin in the forest. Quiet wind, clear skies." I nodded, without hesitation, because some steps don't need a plan, only a heart that's ready. We drove through winding roads in the low hills, where the treetops had begun to turn gold, and the air carried the scent of dry wood, damp earth, and a hint of sweet pine resin. Ben had rented a small wooden cabin deep in the forest for our weekend getaway, a place with no traffic, no streetlights, just the wind and the quiet breath of the mountains. The cabin was simple, yet warm. The fireplace crackled softly. The tiny kitchen held 2 ceramic mugs and a jar of wild honey. Together, we made a humble dinner. Creamy pumpkin soup and toasted bread. Everything moved slowly, gently, as if even time itself had decided to sit down and rest a while. That night, when the moon rose high, and a light mist began to settle over the porch roof, we took a blanket and sat outside on the wooden steps. Neither of us spoke much. Ben draped the blanket over my shoulders, and I let it stay, not because I was cold, but because I liked how he did it. Quietly, without flair, but always at the right moment. I turned toward him. The moonlight shimmered in his eyes. Then he took out a small box. No kneeling.
No teatrix.
Just opened it and said, "Martha, I don't have much. Just a heart that once learned to be silent, then slowly learned to beat again.
And now,
I want it to beat in rhythm with yours, if you'll let it." I didn't speak, not out of hesitation, but because something inside me cracked open, like water, like light, like the quiet joy of finally being chosen. I nodded. No words, because sometimes a simple nod is a long enough poem to tell the story of a whole lifetime. He slipped the ring onto my finger. It was simple, no diamonds, but it fit perfectly, just like how we had entered each other's lives, through small gestures, gentle touches, and silences that never needed filling. That night, I lay in Ben's arms, without dreams, my head resting on someone who hadn't promised forever, but who I trusted would stay, and stay with sincerity. The next morning, I woke as sunlight streamed through the wooden slats. Ben was still asleep, his breath steady and calm. I looked at him, then at my hand, now wearing a small, quiet ring, and I understood. Sometimes, a storm doesn't come to destroy. It comes to cleanse, and what remains afterward is the beginning. That autumn, the rain seemed to do more than water the forest. It washed something clean within me. I once thought I had made peace with loneliness, had grown comfortable in my withdrawal, had accepted a life where my heart was like an old door, shut tightly for fear the wind might sneak in. But then, Ben came, not like a whirlwind, but like the season's first rain, quiet, gentle, patient. Looking back, the path we walked wasn't long, but it was deep enough for me to see clearly. It all began with something seemingly small, someone who cared at the right moment. If Ben hadn't knocked that day, if he hadn't left a bowl of soup, hadn't written that little note, hadn't sat beside me in my silence, I might still be alive, but living as if I were slowly fading from the world. We didn't have a fairy tale.
No dramatic twists.
No grand surprises. But maybe that's what made it real. A meeting of two people who once thought they had outlived their season for love, and then discovered the heart doesn't age. It just needs gentler hands to be willing to open again. Ben and I didn't change the world,
But we changed ourselves.
and for me, that was a quiet revolution.
No fireworks.
Just candlelight, and a hand holding mine tightly enough to remind me I didn't have to keep walking alone. I relearned how to speak my feelings. He learned how to listen with his whole heart. And together, we learned how to heal from the most broken places inside us. I want to leave this with you, the one reading these final lines. If you're tired,
If you've closed yourself off,
if you think no one patient enough will ever stay, slow down a little. Maybe someone is already knocking, and maybe all you need to do is open your heart just enough to hear it. Because sometimes, what saves a person isn't advice, isn't logic, but the timely presence of a heart that's warm enough to stay. If this story made you smile, or left you in silence for a long while, please consider subscribing. Not for the numbers, but because I truly believe this. The world still needs gentle stories, like how two tired souls found each other, not through loud declarations, but through quiet, unwavering presence. There are days when loneliness doesn't show itself through a sigh, but through a silence so long, so haunting, that it echoes inside your very own home. I live in a small, quiet neighborhood, the kind where people wave while mowing their lawns, ask how you're doing when picking up the mail, and then keep walking. Not noisy, not intimate, just enough to be part of the scenery. I, Martha, have lived here for most of my life. But lately, I no longer feel like I'm part of anything. With age comes aching knees, unexplained fatigue, and worst of all, the sense that I'm slowly fading away from this world. I sat in my familiar armchair, staring out at the garden I once cared for. Now the grass is patchy. The flowers no longer bloom like they used to. I don't have the strength. And worse still, I no longer look forward to anything. Family is busy. Friends have grown distant. I blame no one. But my heart has never felt more barren. And that's when the knock came. It startled me. No one had called ahead. No one ever dropped by unannounced. My heart skipped, not from fear, but because, strangely, such an ordinary sound reminded me that I still existed. I walked over, opened the door, and there he was, standing in the soft afternoon light, Ben. Ben, the neighbor who's lived next door for a few years now.
A quiet man, reserved.
Around my age, we'd exchanged nods, talked about the weather, but we had never truly looked each other in the eye. Today, he held a small bag and wore a gentle smile. "Hello, Miss Martha." The first time he'd ever said my name. "I made some chicken soup. Thought you might need something warm." I stood still, not sure if it was surprise or the stirring of something I hadn't felt in so long. Being noticed. "Thank you, Ben." I reached for the bag, my hands trembling just a little. "You look a bit tired. If you ever need someone to talk to, or just sit with, don't hesitate to knock. We're neighbors after all." He turned and walked away, slowly, without expecting anything. But those words, they clung to something parched and quiet inside me. I stepped back into the house, cradling the bag of soup as if holding a kind of warmth I couldn't name. And I cried, not out of sadness, but because, for the first time in a very long while, I felt like I was still someone worth knocking on the door for. If you've ever felt like you're slowly disappearing from everyone's eyes, if you've ever lived in a house full of lights but no visitors, then subscribe to this channel. Because here, every story is a gentle knock on your door, reminding you that you're still here, that someone, truly, might still see you. And then, just one day later, when Ben returned with a small bag of fresh fruit, I realized it wasn't the food that warmed my heart. It was the look in someone's eyes, who truly wanted to ask, "Are you okay?" Mark stepped in, bringing with him the rain and a quiet, inexplicable awkwardness. His shirt clung to his body, raindrops dripping onto the wooden floor. He stood there like a child knocking on a stranger's door, his blue-gray eyes wet, not just from the storm, but from something deeper. I handed him a thick cotton towel, the one I usually wrap myself in after stepping out of the bath on cold days. "Thank you," he said, voice trembling. "I didn't mean to intrude, it's just—" "I know," I gently interrupted. "On nights like this, if neighbors don't take care of each other, then what's the point of living next door?" He smiled, the first smile I'd seen on him that wasn't just polite. It carried a trace of gratitude, a hint of embarrassment, and something that looked like relief. I led him into the living room. The candles still flickered on the table, casting warm light onto the ceiling like soft stains of comfort. In that moment, my little house, once filled with only me, suddenly felt alive. Mark sat down, wrapping his hands around the cup of tea I had brewed before the power went out. His hands still trembled slightly. I realized it wasn't from the cold, but from some emotion he hadn't yet named. "The tree fell and blocked the whole path," he said, eyes fixed on the candlelight. "I just moved here. Don't really have anyone to call yet. I saw your house still lit and thought maybe." "My name is Diane," I said with a smile. "And next time, don't hesitate. Just knock." We sat like that, surrounded by the steady rhythm of rain tapping on the roof and the occasional crackle of candlelight. Two strangers, two warm mugs, and a kind of understanding that needed no explanation. Mark spoke of his wife, who passed away 5 years ago, of living alone, of thinking he was okay. I listened quietly. Some stories don't need replies, they just need someone to sit with them and not look away. When it was my turn, I spoke of my former marriage. No tragedy, no betrayal. Just two people who stopped touching each other with their hearts. It's strange, I murmured. Loneliness isn't when you're alone. It's when someone is next to you and you still feel cold. Mark nodded, his eyes lingering where my hands were wrapped around my knees. Silence, he said, is what kills the fastest, not storms. Another moment of silence fell between us, but this time, it didn't feel heavy. It felt like two people listening to music together, each hearing their own melody, yet still beating in rhythm. I reached out and gently touched his hand. Not with intention, not with reason, just a reflex when you see someone needing to touch something warmer than air. He placed his hand over mine.
Lightly. So lightly.
But that touch didn't just grasp flesh. It said, I understand you, and you're not the only one who feels the cold. Inside me, a breeze stirred, not a gust, just enough to rustle a leaf that had long been asleep. And when he said, I don't want to bother you, I found myself wondering, what if this kind of bother is exactly what I've needed more than a peaceful evening? My name is Diane, 47 years old. I live in Willow Creek, a quiet little town where the hills roll like fleece blankets and every house seems to know the name of the next. In this place, the wind rarely rebels. Everything is in order.
Calm.
And sometimes so calm that you forget you're alive. For the past 10 years, I've lived alone after my divorce. No drama, no fights, just a marriage that drifted into a quiet fog. We became two good friends, then two strangers sharing the same kitchen, and then silence. I've grown used to solitude, but lately, it hasn't felt like a shadow anymore. It's like a hollow sound echoing through morning coffee rituals, through the ticking of the clock at midnight. I've started to feel like I'm waiting for something.
Vague.
Nameless. I didn't expect it to arrive with a storm. It was a Friday night. I was watching an old black and white film when the power went out. The house fell into darkness, leaving only the sound of wind howling at the windows and flashes of lightning ripping across the sky. I fumbled for candles, wrapped myself in the blanket my mother left behind, and told myself to just wait out the storm, like always. Then the knock at the door.
Sudden.
Firm.
Cold.
My heart clenched. Who would come at a time like this? I tiptoed to the door with a flashlight in hand. Through the window pane, I saw a man, soaked, shivering under the eaves. It was Mark, the neighbor 2 houses down. He had moved in a few months ago. Quiet, polite, always as composed as an autumn morning breeze. I opened the door. Diane, I'm so sorry to bother you, but a big tree just fell, blocking my way out. No power. My phone's dead. I don't have anyone else to call. Without hesitation, I pulled him inside. The rain lashed at our backs like 1,000 needles. Sometimes, what changes our life doesn't arrive with fanfare, but with someone knocking on the night of a storm. That night, Mark knocked on my door. But what he truly touched wasn't just the doorknob. Clapperboard if you've ever lived in a house, so quiet you could hear your heart slowly drying out. Then this story is for you. Subscribe to the channel, so that when the storm comes, you don't have to face it alone. That man walked into my living room, still dripping from the rain, and I never knew a storm could bring such warmth. Outside, the rain kept pouring in fierce waves, as if trying to wash away every familiar sound of the quiet little neighborhood. Thunder cracked across the sky from time to time, lightning flashing through the window panes, casting flickering shadows that danced across the walls. But inside that room, a gentle stillness had bloomed, like a pause between 2 chapters of life that had unexpectedly crossed paths. Mark spoke more than I expected.
About the hollow nights.
About losing his wife, not to a sudden death, but to a slow unraveling caused by an illness he couldn't save her from. His voice grew hoarse when recounting the parts he missed most.
And I didn't ask further. Sometimes just being there is enough.
I spoke, too, more than I thought I would, to a neighbor I had only just learned the name of hours ago, about a marriage with no betrayal, only exhaustion, about waking up every morning next to someone, close enough to touch physically, but separated by an emotional ocean. Loneliness, I whispered, isn't the absence of someone beside you. It's having them there, and still having to carry all the sadness on your own. Mark was silent. Then he said, "That's the most accurate description I've ever heard." The candlelight softened his face, stripping away the firm edges I had associated with him. There was something deeply honest in his gaze, not pity, not longing, but presence. A full, unwavering presence. A man who was truly here, with me, in the very moment when I felt like I might break. "Diane," Mark hesitated. "I know tonight is strange. I don't want to make you uncomfortable, but I'm really grateful you opened the door." I looked at him, and for the first time in many years, I let my heart speak before my logic. So, am I, Mark. Maybe I've been waiting for a knock on the door for far too long. He didn't say anything else. We simply sat there, close enough for our shoulders to brush. Outside, the thunder still roared. But inside me, there was only the quiet warmth of someone who truly saw me. No effort, no defense, just two people, in the middle of a storm, reaching back toward the parts of themselves they thought were gone. And when the skies finally began to calm, I realized what remains after the storm isn't just puddles or broken branches. It's the eyes of someone who sat beside you the whole night without promises, without expectations, and yet somehow made you feel not alone anymore. The next morning, sunlight slipped through the curtains, casting a soft golden glow across the wooden floor, warm and tender, like a gentle caress on a restless night's sleep. The storm had passed. Trees outside leaned wearily, a few broken branches scattered across the yard. There was no more rain, but inside me lingered the echoes of what had happened the night before, the longest night I'd lived through in many years. Mark left just as dawn broke. He apologized for staying so long. I didn't say much, just smiled and softly said, "If there's ever another storm, you'll know which door to knock on." He smiled back, eyes brighter than the first light spilling onto the porch. That afternoon, as I was gathering fallen branches from the yard, I saw Mark return. He wore an old t-shirt, with a saw and a coil of rope in hand. "The tree in front of my house fell over the fence," he said, his eyes holding a mix of awkwardness and gratitude. "But I think I could use some help." I didn't hesitate. "Then let's clean it up together." Mark blinked in surprise, then laughed. "I thought you'd say, well, I've got my own yard to deal with too."
Ida.
"But these hands have been working alone for too long. I want to try working side by side for a change." We worked for nearly 3 hours, sawing, dragging, piling branches. Sweat soaked through our shirts, resin clung to our hands, but I had never felt a post-storm afternoon so light, so free. During the breaks, Mark shared stories from his younger years. I laughed, really laughed, for the first time in what felt like forever. Not out of politeness, not to fill silence, but because joy was real again, and perhaps because for the first time, I didn't feel alone in my own yard. As the sun began to set, we leaned against Mark's porch railing, each with a glass of chilled lemonade. "Diane," he said, gazing into the distance, "some storms come just to remind us how long we've been lonely without even knowing it." I didn't answer right away. I set my glass down, turned toward him, and looked carefully into his face. "You know, I used to think that if someone touched me now, I might fall apart. But when you showed up last night, I didn't break. I began to come back." We fell into silence. But this silence wasn't empty. It was full, like a warm blanket draped over your shoulders after a long, cold day. That night, when Mark called, his voice felt like a gentle wave lapping at the quiet shore inside me. "Diane, would you have dinner with me?" Not out of formality, just because I want to see you without the candlelight. The next morning, sunlight slipped through the curtains, casting a soft golden glow across the wooden floor, warm and tender, like a gentle caress on a restless night's sleep. The storm had passed. Trees outside leaned wearily,